It was a cold, quiet night when tragedy struck. Young Marcus sat in the back seat of his father's patrol car, a place he had grown accustomed to, watching his father work. His father, Officer James Mitchell, was a dedicated cop, known in the community for his fairness and commitment to justice. Marcus admired him deeply. It wasn't often that the young boy got to spend time with his father on the job, but tonight was different. The streets were empty, and the silence between them felt peaceful. Marcus felt safe with his father, even in the city's rougher neighborhoods. They were in a part of town where crime ran high, but Officer Mitchell was respected. The boy didn't know that this peaceful night would be the last time he'd see his father alive. As they drove down the street, a sudden flash of movement caught his father's eye. The patrol car stopped, and Officer Mitchell spoke into his radio, calling for backup. Marcus didn't understand the details but knew his father was always careful. He trusted him, but there was a growing feeling in the pit of his stomach that something was wrong. Out of nowhere, a dark van pulled up beside them. Before Marcus could react, the side door of the van swung open, and gunshots rang out. The boy froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. His father's body jerked violently as bullets hit their target. He watched, wide-eyed and terrified, as the life drained from the man he admired so much. Officer Mitchell slumped forward, his hands falling off the steering wheel. The car rolled to a slow stop. For a few long seconds, Marcus sat frozen in place, his mind unable to process the horror he had just witnessed. His father, the protector of the community, the man who had always promised to keep him safe, was now gone. The attackers quickly disappeared into the night, leaving Marcus alone in the car with his father's lifeless body. His mind raced as he screamed for help, but there was no answer. His father had always told him that the world could be cruel, but Marcus had never truly understood what that meant until now. Moments later, the sirens of backup arrived, but it was too late. The man Marcus had looked up to was gone, and the people responsible were still out there. The police quickly began their investigation, but the city was filled with rumors. No one knew who the killers were or why they had targeted Officer Mitchell. To the public, it was just another case of violence in the streets. But to Marcus, it was personal. His world had been turned upside down. The loss of his father left a hole in his heart, one that would never heal. The boy sat silently in the back seat, staring at the world outside the window, feeling as if it had become a much darker place. In the days that followed, no one could answer the questions Marcus had. Why had his father been killed? Who had done this? The police tried to investigate, but the answers never came. For Marcus, the questions never stopped. The pain of losing his father was unbearable, but it sparked something deeper inside him, something that would stay with him for years to come. Years passed, but for Marcus, the pain of that night never faded. He grew older, but the memory of his father's death haunted him like a shadow. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see the flash of gunfire, the lifeless body of his father, and the empty seat beside him in the patrol car. The world had taken his father away, and Marcus was left with a burning question. Why? In the beginning, Marcus was filled with anger. It wasn't just the loss of his father that tormented him, but the feeling of helplessness that came with it. No one seemed to care. The police, despite their efforts, couldn't find the killers. The case went cold, and the world moved on. But Marcus couldn't forget. He knew that his father didn't deserve to die that way, and he believed that the people responsible for it should pay. As he grew older, the anger inside him only grew stronger. The streets where his father had once served were still dangerous, and Marcus could see how little had changed. It made him angry to think that the same kind of people who had taken his father's life were still out there, hurting others. He wanted justice, not just for his father, but for everyone who had been hurt by the same kind of people. Marcus couldn't forget about the day his father had died. It became the center of his world. Every day, he pushed himself harder, focusing on building himself up, both physically and mentally. He trained his body to be stronger, faster, and more prepared for anything. He read books on law enforcement, learning everything he could about police work, investigations, and the way the system worked. But more than anything, he focused on revenge. At night, he would lie awake, thinking about the officers who had let his father's death go unanswered. He wasn't sure if they were involved in the murder, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they had said. The anger that had started as a small spark had grown into a raging fire, and Marcus knew he had to do something about it. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the world to change. If no one was going to give him the justice he craved, he would have to take it himself. But deep down, Marcus struggled with the idea of vengeance. He had always been taught to turn the other cheek, to trust in the system. But the system had failed him. It had failed his father. And so he made a decision. He would make sure that those who had hurt his family would never get away with it again. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but he would find them. He would make them pay for what they had done. The years passed, but the seed of vengeance that had been planted that night continued to grow inside him, stronger with each passing day. Marcus knew that his journey for justice would be difficult and dangerous, but he was ready. He had trained himself for this moment, and he would stop at nothing to make sure his father's death would not be forgotten. Marcus spent years of his life in quiet determination. The anger that had started so many years ago was no longer just about the death of his father. It had become a part of him, shaping who he was and driving him forward. As he grew older, Marcus poured all his energy into making himself stronger, both in body and mind. Every workout, every hour spent studying, was a step closer to finding the justice he sought. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was focused. He realized that if he wanted to make a difference, he had to be more than just a person with a grudge. He had to be someone who could take on the system, someone who could outsmart those who had failed him. But to do that, he needed skills, and he needed knowledge. So, Marcus became a student of many things: law enforcement tactics, criminal behavior, the legal system. He wasn't just preparing to fight. He was preparing to win. At the same time, he honed his physical abilities. He worked tirelessly to build his strength and endurance, training in martial arts and self-defense. He wanted to be ready for anything. As years went by, Marcus became more and more disciplined, always pushing himself beyond his limits. He learned to control his emotions, to keep his anger from clouding his judgment. Every time he felt the old rage flare up inside, he would refocus, reminding himself that this wasn't about personal revenge. It was about bringing justice to his father. Marcus also stayed in close touch with the police world, watching it from a distance. He saw the same corruption, the same system that had failed him, continuing to thrive. It was a hard thing to accept, that the very system his father had worked to protect was so broken. But Marcus had learned the hard way that there was little trust left in the system. It was up to him to take matters into his own hands. Still, Marcus remained patient. He knew that everything had to happen in its own time. He couldn't rush things. Every small step was part of a bigger plan. As the years passed, he made sure he stayed under the radar, blending into the background, always watching, always learning. He needed the right moment, the perfect opportunity to strike. He wasn't just seeking revenge anymore. He was seeking justice for his father and for all the others who had been hurt by the same corruption. Despite the pain he carried, Marcus also built a life for himself. He found a job, started friendships, and tried to live as normally as he could. But no matter where he went or what he did, there was always a part of him that felt incomplete. The desire for justice burned within him, and it was something he couldn't ignore. He knew that he couldn't rest until he had found the truth, and until those responsible for his father's death had paid for their actions. Marcus had grown into a man who was determined, intelligent, and capable. He had become the person he needed to be to fulfill the promise he had made to himself all those years ago, that his father's death would not go unpunished. Now, all he needed was the right moment. and he knew that moment was coming soon. Marcus had spent years preparing, and now it was time to take action. The anger and the desire for justice that had burned inside him for so long were finally about to be channeled into something real. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and he was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. His first step was to dig into the investigation of his father's death. The police had tried, of course, but the case had gone cold years ago. Marcus didn't trust them. He knew there were things they weren't telling him, things that had been covered up. So he began to investigate on his own, quietly gathering information. He started with the basics, looking through old police reports and news articles, trying to find something that had been overlooked. There wasn't much, but there were a few small details that didn't make sense. The van that had pulled up next to the patrol car. No one had ever been able to trace it, and the officers who had responded to the scene had seemed strangely uninterested in finding the truth. Marcus's gut told him that something was wrong, and he wasn't going to rest until he found the answers. He knew he had to be careful. If anyone found out what he was doing, it could all be over. So he worked in the shadows, taking every step cautiously. He spent long hours in libraries and online, looking for connections and clues that might lead him to the men who had killed his father. It wasn't just about finding the killer anymore. It was about understanding why his father had been targeted in the first place. The more he learned, the more he realized how deep the corruption ran. The officers involved in his father's death were part of a network of law enforcement officers who had ties to crime. They weren't just bad cops. They were criminals working with dangerous people. Marcus's heart sank as he uncovered this. His father had been a good cop, someone who had always tried to do the right thing. And now Marcus was learning that the very system his father had served was riddled with rot. But this was just the beginning. Marcus didn't have all the answers yet. He needed to know more, and he needed to find out who was really behind his father's death. He started to focus on the officers who had been closest to the case. He looked at their backgrounds, their relationships, and their actions before and after the killing. The more he dug, the more certain he became that the answers lay in this group of officers. They were hiding something. Marcus knew he had to move carefully, but he also knew he couldn't waste any more time. His father's death had been ignored for far too long, and it was time for that to change. He couldn't let these men go unpunished, not when he was so close to the truth. Every day, he grew more determined to find the answers, to bring those responsible to justice, and to make sure no one else had to suffer the way he had. The investigation had only just begun, but Marcus was already starting to feel the weight of what he was about to uncover. He wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for his father's honor, and for the people who had been hurt by the same kind of corruption. His journey had only just started, and there was no turning back now. As Marcus continued his investigation, he knew that he couldn't do this alone. The more he learned, the more dangerous the situation became. The corrupt officers he was targeting had power, connections, and resources, and Marcus was just one man. He needed help. But finding people he could trust was difficult. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. It took time, but Marcus slowly started to build a small network. His first ally came from an unexpected place, a former cop who had been forced into early retirement after he had questioned the actions of some of his colleagues. The man, named Tom, had left the police force years ago, disgusted by what he had seen. He had no love for the corrupt officers who had taken advantage of their position, but he also had no interest in going up against them, at least not until Marcus came to him with the truth. Marcus explained his father's death, the investigation he had been conducting, and the ties he had uncovered between the corrupt officers and organized crime. At first, Tom was hesitant. He knew how dangerous it could be to challenge the system, but there was something in Marcus's eyes that told him the young man was serious. Tom had seen enough in his years on the force to know that the system wasn't always fair, and he was willing to help Marcus, at least with information. Together, they began to piece together a clearer picture. Tom introduced Marcus to others who had fallen through the cracks of the justice system: former police officers, detectives, and even a few journalists who had been burned by their attempts to expose corruption. These people were also tired of the system failing, and they had their own stories to tell. Some of them had lost family members or friends because of corrupt officers, and they all wanted to make things right. Slowly but surely, Marcus's network began to grow, and with it, his hope that he could truly bring justice to his father's memory. With Tom's help, Marcus gained access to confidential police files and documents that were never meant to be seen by the public. These files contained information about the officers involved in his father's case and their connections to other criminal activities. Marcus was careful, always watching his back, knowing that someone could be watching him at any moment. But he was careful, taking only what he needed and never leaving a trace behind. Each piece of information he uncovered brought him closer to his goal. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Marcus's network continued to grow stronger. He learned how to use the information he gathered to stay one step ahead of the people who were still trying to hide the truth. He knew that in order to succeed, he had to be smarter, more strategic, and more patient than his enemies. And so Marcus kept moving forward, working tirelessly, preparing for the moment when he would finally expose the truth. But there was one thing Marcus knew for sure. He couldn't stop now. His father's death had to mean something. It had to lead to something more than just a search for revenge. He had a responsibility, not just to his father, but to the people who had suffered at the hands of the same corrupt officers. With each new ally he gained and each new clue he uncovered, Marcus felt the weight of his mission grow heavier. But he also felt more confident that justice was within his reach. As Marcus continued to gather information and strengthen his network, he knew that the next phase of his plan would require careful action. The more he learned, the clearer it became that the officers involved in his father's death were deeply connected to a web of corruption and crime. But exposing them wasn't going to be easy. These men had power, and they would stop at nothing to protect themselves. Marcus had to be smart. He couldn't just confront these officers directly, not yet. He needed to gather more evidence, and he had to do it without drawing attention to himself. The last thing he wanted was for the corrupt officers to find out he was onto them. He knew that if they realized he was digging into their past, they would do everything in their power to stop him. He became more cautious, moving in the shadows, using his training to stay hidden. He started to follow the officers involved in his father's case, observing their movements from a distance. He spent hours watching them, taking careful notes, and finding small details that others might have missed. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but Marcus knew that every step he took brought him closer to exposing the truth. One of the officers he focused on was Detective Garrett, a man who had been one of the first to arrive at the scene of his father's death. Garrett had always seemed like a man of integrity, but Marcus had uncovered evidence suggesting that he had been involved in covering up the real story. Garrett had connections to the same criminal groups that Marcus had been studying, and Marcus was certain that he was hiding something. Marcus knew he had to find a way to get close to Garrett, to learn what he knew without raising suspicion. It was a delicate task. He spent weeks tracking Garrett's movements, looking for a moment when he could slip past the officer's defenses. Then, one day, it happened. Garrett made a mistake. He was careless for just a moment, and Marcus saw his chance. He approached Garrett at a local bar, pretending to be someone else. He wasn't sure how he'd be received, but he had no choice but to take the risk. They exchanged small talk at first, and Marcus kept his questions casual, trying to sound like just another person in the crowd. But Marcus was watching Garrett closely, picking up on small details in his speech, his body language, and the way he interacted with others. After a few more conversations, Marcus began to notice subtle signs that Garrett was uncomfortable. It wasn't obvious, but there was something in the way he hesitated when asked about certain topics. Marcus pressed gently, asking questions about his father's death and the investigation. Garrett's responses were vague, But the unease in his eyes was enough for Marcus to know that the detective was hiding something. At the same time, Marcus's network continued to provide him with crucial information. He received more documents, more details that pointed to Garrett's involvement in the cover-up. With each new piece of evidence, Marcus's resolve grew stronger. He was getting closer to the truth, but he had to be careful. If Garrett or any of the other officers found out what he was doing, everything could be ruined. Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. He had to be patient and stay under the radar as he continued his investigation. Every step had to be calculated. Every move had to be precise. But with every passing day, Marcus felt more confident that he was getting closer to uncovering the full truth. The pieces were falling into place, and he was ready for whatever came next. The investigation had reached a tipping point. Marcus had spent months gathering information, staying in the shadows, and slowly piecing together the puzzle. His patience was paying off, but the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The web of corruption he had uncovered was larger than he had ever imagined, and the officers involved in his father's death were powerful men who would stop at nothing to protect themselves. But Marcus was no longer afraid. His determination had only grown stronger. Every piece of evidence he uncovered, every moment of weakness he found in the officers, only fueled his desire to see justice done. He had come too far to turn back now. It was time to make his move. Marcus had spent days preparing for the moment when he would confront the people responsible for his father's death. He had gathered enough evidence to expose them, and he had carefully planned out every detail of his next steps. He knew that this would be the most dangerous part of his journey, but he was ready. He had learned to trust his instincts, and now they told him that the time had come. He began with Detective Garrett. Marcus had been tracking him closely, and he now had the evidence he needed to confront him. It wasn't just about exposing Garrett. It was about shaking the foundation of the corrupt network. If he could take down Garrett, the others would follow. The power of these men was based on their secrecy, and Marcus knew that if he could break it, everything would crumble. One evening, Marcus followed Garrett to a secluded location on the outskirts of the city. The detective had no idea he was being watched, and that was exactly how Marcus wanted it. He had arranged for a quiet meeting, one where he could confront Garrett without alerting anyone else. As Garrett approached the meeting spot, Marcus stepped forward, his face calm but his heart racing. "Detective Garrett," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We need to talk." Garrett froze, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Marcus. He had no idea how much the young man knew, but he could sense the tension in the air. He tried to back away, but Marcus stepped closer, blocking his escape. This wasn't the time for words or threats. It was time for action. "Your silence," Marcus continued, "has cost me everything. My father is dead, and you've done nothing but cover it up." The words hung in the air, and Garrett's face darkened. For a brief moment, Marcus saw the fear in the detective's eyes. He knew that Garrett had something to hide. And now, the truth was catching up to him. Marcus held out the evidence he had gathered. The documents, the recordings, the connections that tied Garrett and his colleagues to the criminal activities. "Your lies have been exposed," Marcus said, "and it's only a matter of time before everyone else knows what you've done." Garrett's jaw clenched, but there was no denying it. Marcus had him cornered, and the truth was out. Garrett didn't know how much more Marcus had, but he could feel the walls closing in. His power was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For Marcus, it was a bittersweet moment. The anger that had fueled him for so long was now mixed with something else, a sense of relief. His father's death was finally being acknowledged. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, and justice was within his reach. But Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there were many more who had to be held accountable. The breaking point had come. The truth had been exposed, and Marcus was ready to finish what he had started. Marcus stood in front of the detective, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and satisfaction. The evidence he had gathered was irrefutable, and it had taken everything he had to get to this point. The truth was now in the open, and there was no turning back. He could see the fear in Detective Garrett's eyes, but it wasn't just fear of Marcus. It was fear of what would happen next. Garrett was trapped. The power he had once held was slipping away with every word Marcus spoke. It was the moment Marcus had been waiting for, the moment when the lies would come crashing down, and the people who had caused his father's death would finally face the consequences. Garrett had tried to hide the truth, but now it was too late. "Do you know what this means?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about my father anymore. This is about everything you've been hiding. All the people you've hurt." Garrett didn't respond. His eyes darted around, searching for a way out, but Marcus had him cornered. The detective knew that his time was up. Marcus had been patient, methodical, and thorough. He had spent years preparing for this moment, and now it was here. The walls had closed in, and there was no escape. As Marcus handed over the evidence, he felt a strange mix of emotions. The anger that had driven him for so long was still there, but it was now tempered with something else: relief. His father's death had not been in vain. The corrupt officers who had caused so much pain and suffering were finally going to be held accountable. The moment of justice was bittersweet, though. Marcus had spent so much time seeking revenge that he hadn't allowed himself to truly grieve for his father. Now, as he watched Garrett's fear, he realized that no amount of vengeance could bring his father back. No matter how much justice he achieved, the hole in his heart would never be filled. But Marcus also knew that this was what his father would have wanted. His father had been a good man, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others. Now, Marcus was making sure that his father's legacy was honored, not just by his own actions, but by the truth being exposed. His father had believed in justice, and Marcus was going to make sure that justice prevailed. The police, now armed with the evidence Marcus had gathered, moved quickly to take action. Detective Garrett and the other officers involved in the cover-up were arrested. Their power was gone, and the truth was finally being recognized. The corrupt network that had controlled so much of the city was falling apart, one piece at a time. As the police took Garrett away, Marcus felt the weight of the years of anger and pain begin to lift. It wasn't over yet. There were still others to be held accountable, and the work was far from done. But this was the first step. Marcus had achieved something that seemed impossible all those years ago when he was just a boy, helpless in the backseat of his father's patrol car. Justice had been served, and it was a victory not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had been affected by the corruption and violence that had plagued their community. The truth had come to light, and Marcus knew that his father would be proud. The battle wasn't over, but Marcus had finally taken the first step toward healing and peace. The days after the arrests were both quiet and overwhelming. Marcus had spent so long focused on the pursuit of justice that when it finally came, he found himself unsure of what to do next. The anger that had driven him for so long had faded, replaced by a deep sense of exhaustion. He had done it. The men who had taken his father's life had been exposed and were facing the consequences of their actions. But the victory, while important, didn't erase the pain. He spent the first few days in a daze, trying to process everything that had happened. His father was gone, and no amount of justice could bring him back. The years of searching, the sleepless nights, the constant drive for revenge, it had all been for this moment. But now, Marcus realized that it wasn't enough. The battle for justice was only one part of his journey. The rest of his life was still ahead of him. It was hard to move forward when everything he had known had been tied to the past. But Marcus understood that he couldn't stay stuck in the anger and grief any longer. His father had always taught him to look ahead, to find a way to make the world better, even when things were difficult. Marcus knew his father would have wanted him to heal, to move forward, and to live a life that honored the man he had been. So, Marcus decided to start small. He reconnected with old friends, people he had pushed away over the years because of his obsession with revenge. He began to focus on the things that had once brought him peace: long walks, quiet moments of reflection, and finding joy in the simple things. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to rest. But the journey of healing wasn't easy. Marcus still found himself waking up in the middle of the night, haunted by memories of his father's death. He would often visit his father's grave, standing there in silence, wishing he could hear his father's voice once more. Yet each time he left the cemetery, he felt a little lighter. The weight of the past was slowly lifting. As the weeks passed, Marcus also found new ways to honor his father's legacy. He became involved in local community programs, working with young people who had been affected by crime and violence. He shared his story with them, not to glorify his journey for revenge, but to teach them that they didn't have to carry their pain forever. There was a way forward, a way to heal, even after the darkest of times. Marcus had learned that justice wasn't just about taking down the bad guys. It was about healing, growing, and creating a future where people didn't have to live in fear. His father had worked for justice his whole life, but Marcus now understood that true justice meant helping others, not just punishing those who had done wrong. He still thought about his father every day, but now it was with a sense of peace. He knew that his father would be proud of him, not for what he had done in the pursuit of revenge, but for what he had done afterward, for moving forward, for living with purpose, and for finding a way to help others. Marcus had finally found a new beginning. The past would always be a part of him, but he knew that he could now look ahead to the future with hope, knowing that he had honored his father's memory in the best way possible.